Blogs have been very effective and best for brainstorming and exchanging different views around a certain topic. So when you blog about a certain topic and you start to open a platform or a forum for discussion, and then I start to join your thread, other friends will also join, and a discussion or a conversation will start to build. We are going to be exchanging views and brainstorming, and as Dr. Erkan mentioned in his kind introduction, my second and most recent co-authored book is called Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, and it did focus specifically on the role of political bloggers in igniting the Egyptian revolution and paving the way for the Egyptian revolution. However, just like everything else in life, we have to also acknowledge the limitations of social media. They might be very powerful and very effective in so many different ways. In, as we said, acting as catalysts for change, mobilizing people for action, networking, and all of the other functions we mentioned. But at the same time, just like everything else in life, they do have their own limitations too. So while they really may aid political change as catalysts and mobilization tools, they are not magical tools. And they cannot bring about political change all by themselves. It is always the people themselves who can make this change happen, who can make the actual change happen. This is a very important point to remember, because as we're going to talk about it later this afternoon, some people tend to overestimate the role of social media and new media. They call the Egyptian revolution the Facebook revolution, Syria, the YouTube uprising, Tunisia, the Twitter revolution. Well, it's the people on the ground who are using these tools, and it's the people on the ground who are able to make the actual change or the real change happen. If people are not willing to go out in the street and protest and demonstrate and pay the full price for political change, no change is ever going to happen, right? Very interestingly here, right after the Egyptian revolution, a group was formed in Egypt. It has a rather long name, but it was very powerful. It called itself, "Just clicking on your computer screen is not going to change the world." Right? So this is the name of the group. Just clicking on the computer screen is not going to change the world. So it's trying to send a message that just using the computer and clicking on the mouse is not political activism. You need to be out there in the streets, and you need to play an effective role in the real world to make change really happen. So this first part of the lecture was very much about the general picture about the Arab Spring or the Arab awareness movements. Where did they start? How did they start? The role of social media more generally. The rest of this lecture will focus specifically on the case of Egypt. Let me just take some water here. What were the causes of the Egyptian revolution which erupted in 2011? There were a number of different causes for the Egyptian revolution of 2011. 30 years of dictatorship and autocratic rule under President Hosni Mubarak, corruption at every level of government, the emergency law which curbed people's freedom of expression and freedom to protest. If people, more than 20 or 30 people gather in the street somewhere, it is very possible for the police to round them up and to put them in jail without any trial, without any questioning. The faulty constitution, which gave the president unlimited powers, did not limit his term in office, did not limit his power or authority, and even made it possible for him to pave the way for his son to start to inherit the presidency. Economic distress, despite Egypt's very rich cultural and historical history. Unfortunately, 40% of the Egyptians live under the international poverty line with less than $2 a day. And I always say the bitter joke that Egypt is the richest country in the whole world because it has been robbed for the last 7,000 years and it still exists and survives despite all of this stealing of its wealth on a consistent basis. Growing calls for constitutional, economic, political, and social reform, forging the results of parliamentary elections, and also the successful popular revolution in Tunisia. And the very last point about Tunisia, it's not really a cause, but I would say it's a trigger. In other words, Egyptians looked at a smaller country like Tunisia and they said, well, if Tunisians were able to oust their dictator and to create some kind of change, why couldn't we, the Egyptians, do it? So it was not a cause, but it was a trigger. People were motivated to follow the Tunisian lead or model, if you will, and say, we can do it too, right? We can make change, we can really oust our own dictator as well. So all of these factors combined, I think, were causes for the Egyptian revolution. So the characteristics of the 2011 Egyptian revolution, it charged the Egyptian people with a new sense of positivity, empowerment, determination, national pride, and solidarity. People became very proud of their national identity as Egyptians, and slogans like "raise your head up high, you are Egyptian," be proud of yourself, you are Egyptian, that became very powerful. It was a peaceful grassroots youthful revolution that was across the board, involving different political, religious, and social groups. President Barack Obama commented on the Egyptian revolution at the time, and he said he admired the Egyptian protesters who were protesting on the streets day after day, peacefully, and he even said in his own speech the word silmiya, silmiya, and silmiya means peacefully, right? So he was, kind of admiring their, peaceful protest. A unique leaderless revolution, we talked about this point about leaderlessness before, and we talked about some of the reservations around this term, why we should not take it for granted or take it at face value. Solidarity, unity between Muslims and Coptic Christians in a very strong, very powerful way. You will see, for example, Muslims praying on Friday in the middle or the heart of Tahrir Square, being surrounded by a circle of Coptic Christians, holding hands in order to protect their fellow citizens while they're doing the Friday prayers, so that none of the security forces can attack them while they are praying, and vice versa. You will see Muslims who are protecting the Christians while they're praying, and so on. It was very, very powerful images. You will see a woman who is wearing the niqab, which is the face veil, covering her face, and she is holding hands with a priest. They're both holding hands in the middle of Tahrir Square. A woman who's wearing the niqab and a priest. Very iconic, very powerful images that emerged from the heart of this historical revolution. A significant role played by youth and significant role played by women, as we'll talk about these in a moment, and also signaled a new era of social and democratic reform. President Barack Obama said in one of his speeches, and I quote him here, "Egypt will not go back to where it was before January 25th, 2011. So even with all the setbacks and all the unfortunate derailing of the democratic process in Egypt, right? I think that he is right in his estimation or his guess that Egypt will not go back to where it was, because Egyptian people learned that they can have a say, they can make a change, they can make a difference, they can have an impact on the ground, and they can really make a difference in their own country's political and social history. So I also think that the Egyptian revolution had some kind of impact on the Arab world as well. And the domino effect, or the ripple effect, started to snowball. Echoes of both the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolutions in Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, Jordan, and Syria. These are countries that witnessed some kind of Arab awakening or revolt to varying degrees and varying results. And in my opinion, there was some kind of ripple effect or some kind of snowball effect or impact from the eruption of the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolution that started to have an impact on these other countries, but of course with different outcomes and different degrees, like we mentioned before. Arab rulers started to take some steps in the direction of political reform. Look, for example, at the examples of Morocco and Jordan. In these two countries, there was an attempt to protest and to make voices heard, and the rulers, the kings in these two countries, were smart enough to respond to people's attempts for change. So they did not just, ignore people's wishes or people's desire for change until things got out of hand, like we have seen in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in Syria, and so on. They were smart enough to get the pulse of the street and to feel that people really want some kind of change, and to respond to these changes and to do some kind of constitutional reform in order to absorb people's anger and to avoid the possibility of a wider scale revolution erupting. Arab governments cannot ignore the power of the Arab public opinion anymore, or the power of public opinion in their own countries and their own streets, even in the most conservative Gulf countries. So even in some of the most conservative Gulf countries, we are seeing some small baby steps in the direction of reform in order to absorb people's anger. Sometimes giving them bigger paychecks. You'll see thousands of riyals or whatever currency increase in people's paycheck as an attempt to make people more satisfied and less willing to revolt. But there have been also attempts to create some kind of change. For example, in Saudi Arabia, one of the most conservative traditional countries in the region, women are for the first time allowed representation in the Shura Council. Is this enough? Of course not, but it's a small step in the right direction. So there are now some signals to show that the rulers are starting to hear the pulse of the streets and to listen to the voices of their own people. A new era of political change, empowerment, and awakening started in the Arab world. So I think that the Egyptian revolution did have some kind of effect or some kind of impact on the Arab world in these many different ways. The Egyptian government's communication strategy. I would like to talk here and compare two very interesting points. The Egyptian government's communication strategy and the Egyptian protesters' communication strategy. What did the Egyptian government do in order to appeal to people during the 2011 revolution? And what did the protesters or the activists themselves do? It's a very interesting comparison. The government itself combined the suppression of the protesters on the streets with the suppression of the truth through national and state-controlled media. They cracked down on foreign journalists. They closed down the office of Al Jazeera in Cairo and detained some of its staff members. They cut off the cell phone lines for a few days, and they blocked off the internet for a whole week. They simply pushed down the kill switch. They used the mentality of the 50s and the 60s, and the failed and incompetent political strategy was coupled with an equally ineffective communication strategy. So I would say combining both political ineffectiveness and incompetency with communication and media incompetency as well. They cannot just do that in the year 2011. You cannot just cut cell phones. You cannot just cut the internet. And Egyptians were very creative, as we're going to see in a moment, in finding alternative ways to access news and information and spread their messages, despite all of these attempts by the government to put some kind of blackout on the media arena and to cut all of these services. So what were the activists' communication strategies? They deployed new social media, posting and chatting on Facebook, tweeting, blogging, and texting. Facebook became the people's book, and that's why some people called it the Facebook revolution, although I have my reservation about the term, as I said before. Creating the missing link between mediated self-expression and street mobilization, or between the virtual world and the real world. And finding alternative creative ways to access and spread information. For example, the speak-to-tweet service and using Hotbird instead of Nilesat to watch Al Jazeera. So I'd like to talk about this because it's very, very interesting. Despite all of the government's attempts to create some kind of block out and to really kind of, create some kind of blockage of news and information, cutting cell phones and cutting the internet, Egyptian protesters and activists have been very, very active. They use social media and new media in very creative ways. They use them in order to spread the news and information. But most interestingly, they also found ways in order to overcome the government's blackout. For example, the speak-to-tweet service. This is a service where people can simply dial a certain number and they can dial and they can talk to Twitter. And they can feed their message verbally despite the lack of internet connection or connectivity. They can just feed the message verbally to Twitter over the phone and the message is going to appear on the internet. Very interesting. When the government decided to remove Al Jazeera completely from Nilesat, which is the satellite controlled by the Egyptian government, they used Hotbird instead in order to watch Al Jazeera, and so on. And in many cases, shutting down the internet and cutting off the cell phone actually backfired. It created a counter effect. Because when people could not find their own family and friends and colleagues online, they said, oh my God, there must be something terrible happening. So they started to storm the streets of Cairo in even larger and greater numbers and to really create a much bigger effect. So I would even say that the government policy of blocking the news information backfired and created counter effects. So the multiple roles of new media in the Egyptian revolution, they were catalysts that paved the way for democratic transition. They were platforms for self-expression. They were channels for communication and organization. They were bridge builders between the young activists and their followers, or between the virtual world and the real world. They were avenues for civic engagement and popular participation. In other words, turning the function from safety valves to mobilization tools. And they were also an arena for a new form of citizen journalism. Let me just explain the last 2 points. When the term safety valve was used by a number of scholars, including myself, we were referring to the process whereby the government would just allow a very small margin of political representation and opposition voices to be heard on a limited, small scale. Why? Because they thought that, just like the safety valve in the pot, right, that lets some of the steam off so that the pot does not explode. If they allow this little margin of freedom or little margin of opposition, then hopefully they're gonna avoid the eruption of much bigger protests. But of course, eventually, people were boiling enough with anger that the pot has exploded and the revolutions erupted anyway. But here, social media turned the function from being safety valves to becoming actual effective mobilization tools for actual change and for actual protest. And also, as we said before, the function of citizen journalism, average people, ordinary people like me and you, using their cell phones, their cameras, their digital devices to capture images and pictures and send them to the rest of the world, became very powerful indeed. So, why youth leadership? The title of this lecture was Youth and Women's Leadership, New Media and the Arab Spring, right? So youth and women in particular played a very, very important role in the Arab Spring in general, and in the case of the Egyptian revolution in particular, and that's why they deserve special attention. So why youth leadership in particular? Young people are now the fastest growing population of the areas where reform is needed. So places where people are in developing countries, for example, or they need reform, change politically and socially, you will find young people are the fastest growing segments in these countries. For example, in the Arab world, 70% of the population in the Arab world are now under the age of 30. That's a very, very significant number. Many of these people are agents of change with their open-mindedness, their desire for reform, creativity, energy, and determination. They're also very technologically savvy and comfortable with using new media tools. And also, they were the main driving forces behind grassroots movements and calls for change, such as the Kifaya movement and the April 6th movement, which were some of the movements on the ground in Egypt that were calling for change and calling for ousting